you're building a fuel system for an exotic car like a Viper, what better to use for your centerpiece than a $7 Amazon utensil holder? Yeah. First, let me explain what the purpose of all this is, this entire contraption. So the factory Viper uses a bucket that sits in the tank, and it's got a pump, and the pump has two separate inlets. One inlet is just the feed from the bucket, so the fuel in the bucket gets fed into the motor. The second inlet is a feed that actually fills the bucket with fuel from the outside of the tank, from the rest of the tank. So that keeps the bucket full, keeps the pump submerged, even under acceleration, lateral G's, because this is an 18-gallon tank, so it's, or about 18 gallons. It's a pretty big tank, and there's zero baffling inside this tank. So without some sort of a bucket mechanism to keep that fuel around the pump, you would just be getting slosh all the way to one side, all the way to the other, and you'd lose fuel around your pickup and starve for fuel, especially at like levels less than a half tank. So what I set out to do was to build something, because I didn't have the factory bucket or pump, it was parted out from this car. So I wanted to build something that would support my 500 or so wheel horsepower on E85, but also control fuel well enough for a road course car, track attack car, time attack car. So this is what I came up with for a cheap solution. This is a billet pump pad for a Dodge truck. So all older Dodge trucks, I think it's like 90s into the early 2000s, they all use the same diameter ring that the Viper uses. So it's the same top hat gasket, the same locking ring that goes on top. So this billet pump pack they make for older Dodge trucks to retrofit a later model EFI pump into. Holley makes it has like a billet bracket inside that will fit a Walbro 255, 450, 525. They all use the same diameter of the pump body. They just have larger outer diameters of like the bottom ring, bottom area. I have that, and I'll explain a little bit more about this because there's a few options for this. Then what I have is the utensil holder here acting as the bucket. I have one-way check valves. These are Aeromotive. They make these for a phantom fuel bladder. It's designed to be pushed into a soft bladder, so there's barbs, there's no bulkhead. So what I had to do to fit these was grind out around the top a little bit larger than the bottom, so they could kind of push in and drop down. Then I use this ring to kind of cinch them down. I still need to do some playing with this because they include like a split washer gasket that goes behind them. And again, it's not made for a hard mounting surface like this. I use them, but they're not big enough to cover the entire hole where I had to grind out around the outside. So I'll probably try to find some larger diameter Viton gaskets that I could stick behind there just to seal these a little bit better to the assembly, so when fuel pushes and closes that check valve, you don't have fuel coming out around the perimeter of that ball valve. And inside of here, I just cut some L brackets, 90-degree stainless steel brackets. So I tacked these bolts into the L brackets just to make it easier, so you don't have to fish a wrench down into there when you're tightening it. And these L brackets just hold this entire thing in. And then I use some springs from the hardware store just to mount this hat, and I'll show you guys why in a second. But first, let me go over the pump hat assembly. So Holley makes a few different versions of this. They make them with a 255, they make them with a 450 liter per hour pump, and they make it with a return or returnless. I got this one on sale from Holley for $295. The usual price for like the 450 with a return setup is like $575, so it made sense to pick this one up for much cheaper. But this, you do have to make a few modifications. Or you need a few parts to modify it in order to make it work for what I'm trying to do, which is a bypass return system, because I'm going to have a bypass regulator at the front of my car feeding fuel back into the tank. So I got these parts for free. I don't know how much they would cost through Holley, but I'll list the part numbers in the description. But this is all you would need to convert it. And there's a few different ways you can do it. So first, because this is the returnless version, you need to buy a return fitting, which is just a little brass fitting that goes into here, and it fits in with a snap ring. And everything on this Holley module uses a snap ring to lock it in place. So the fittings, the barbed fittings that come out of here, use snap rings, and even the wire harness has like a potted O-ring, and that uses a snap ring to hold it in place. So you just buy those correct brass fittings, pop it in, put the snap ring in, and now you have a barb, and you can run a hose down into your bucket for your fuel return, and that directs your fuel return to wherever you want it. And then the second thing you need to do is modify the wiring harness, or buy the correct wiring harness, because the Walbro 450 and 525 pumps both use their own MetroPack connector. It's the same one for either pump, but the 255s uses this Deutsch connector that's not the same. The wiring gauge is the same, so all you would really need to do is just cut this connector and then splice your, crimp your ends on for the Walbro MetroPack connector, or you can use an adapter. Aeromotive makes an adapter for these for like 50 bucks. Or you could do what I did and just buy the correct harness from Holley, and this just plugs in with the snap ring, and now you have your correct wiring harness for a 450 or a 525 liter per hour pump. Holley doesn't make this with a 525, so if you buy the 450 version, it'll be plug and play. You could just bolt the 525 in, plug it in, the harness will be the same. And if you buy that version with the return setup already plumbed, then you don't need to buy that extra fitting either. But again, I did this the cheaper way because this was on sale, so I just needed to do a little changing up to it to make it work. So the only thing that's really needed to make this actually fit in here is these rods that the pump hangs on. You just need to cut these down to the right height. So what I did was I measured about a ½ inch off the bottom of the tank, and that's where I wanted my pump to sit, because this bucket's gonna sit on I wanna put a Viton pad under here just to stop it from chafing, and that's gonna be 1/4 inch, and then I wanted to leave another 1/4 inch or so for the pump stock. So I measured about a ½ inch off the bottom of the tank, set your depth, and then cut these down to whatever height you need to sit that pump in that position. And then from there, the reason I use springs is because if you were to not use, a lot of factory pump hat and pump bucket assemblies use a spring setup like this, because if you were to try to get this whole bucket assembly exactly where it needs to be, you might come up a little too long, and then when you tighten this down, it's gonna push at the bottom of the tank and bow that tank. And it also, because you know the tanks contract and expand a little bit, you might have chafing or whatnot. And if you make it too short, now the pump bucket's not sitting at the bottom of the tank, and it's just kind of floating, and you're not getting all that fuel from the bottom. So this just seemed like the neatest way of doing it to me, because it's the way the factory does it. It makes it easier, takes the guesswork out of cutting the tank brackets down. So these are just springs, and when you sit this whole thing into here, I'm missing my pad at the bottom, so it's going to be not the right height right now, but you can see now this just pushes in with spring pressure, and when you tighten this down, it'll keep it seated at the bottom of the tank, just enough tension that it'll stay at the bottom of the tank but not be bowing the bottom of the tank out. So that was the goal for that. So again, you'll set your pump height, because the pump height's always going to be the same. The pump's going to bottom out against this ring and sit where it sits, but the bucket is what you have the adjustability with the springs. The only other thing that's an issue with this is obviously the sending unit. So you could probably make a Viper sending unit work. There's a sending unit that's included with this, but it's a 20 to 220 ohm, so it wouldn't work with a Viper gauge. You probably can make the Viper sender work if you maybe cut like a notch and stuck the float out and bent it a little bit so it works. But that would probably be hard to get into the tank as well. I just opted to use this. It's a Holley Lidar sender. It just uses a laser and shoots the laser down to the bottom of the tank and reads the fuel level via laser. It has variable resistance ranges that you could program, so you could wire this into any any gauge unit. You just pick up the gauge wires where they would have meant the sender and splice this in, and you could program this to work with whatever resistance range your gauge cluster uses. It's kind of nice because it also has some adjustability with sensitivity. So if you have issues with like fuel slosh causing it to go up and down and it's hard to read the fuel level, you could program this to be less sensitive to movement and changes. So it usually tends to be a little more accurate than a float assembly sender. But I just liked it because you just drill some holes, you stick it in any flat spots. So I'll probably put it right around here. Has a gasket that goes with it, and that just sits right there and shoots the laser down. You don't have to worry about a sender or a float. So how this all works is, again, the bucket will fill up to the prevailing rate of fuel because these check valves will be free floating when it's sitting in the bucket at a level without any G-forces. This will fill up pretty much instantly to the level of fuel, and then when you make turns, the check valves are going to close and not let the fuel out, in theory. You're also going to have, because this is a bypass regulated setup, all the return fuel that's not being used is going to be feeding back into the bucket. So it's going to be constantly replenishing this bucket. So even when you take a turn and fuel does start to drain down, it's still replenishing fuel into here to keep it sustained. I was also thinking about experimenting with a siphon jet setup using a Venturi valve. Radium makes like a three-way valve that's a Venturi. So you would run that on your return line, and from the return outlet here, the pressure wave from the return fuel feeding back would suck fuel in then through the T-fitting. There's a third port, and then you would run that port to someplace on the bucket on the outside where it could suck fuel in via the tank. The issue with that is because the check balls are allowing the fuel to equalize in level in the tank until there's G-forces, that Venturi would be feeding fuel into here, but it would all be just leveling out anyway. So it would all be, emptying back out to the main part of the tank and wouldn't actually be benefiting the bucket in any way. And then when you actually throw the car into a turn, it's going to be a crapshoot of whether or not that feed is being uncovered or not being uncovered to actually help it all. So obviously you only have one feed for that. So I suppose maybe you could tee the feed off, but I think it would probably not work so well. And I don't think it would be flowing enough fuel in that, like when you take a turn, if you were to, make that turn and now the turn's sustained and the bucket's not replenishing, that Venturi, if it's running dry on one side, it's probably not going to fill this thing up. Or even if it is, even if it was on this side and it was picking up fuel from over here where the fuel was sloshing to, I just don't think it's going to be pulling enough fuel in to really keep this thing full, sustained in a turn. I think just relying on the bucket being full from whatever was in there prior to the turn is going to be the best bet.
Here is the test. I found a Tupperware that I had lying around that's similar in dimensions to the bottom of the Viper tank. It's probably slightly smaller capacity, but you can see the Viper tank kind of indents up. So you lose some surface area in there, some volume, but it has this, but that's, very, very thin. So it's close, it's not exact, but at least they'll give us kind of an idea of what fuel capacity, how many gallons we'll need in the bottom of the tank to kind of get that pump submerged. I feel like that dude that makes the giant drinks in the sink. 1 gallon, gonna make a jamba juice. So we are at 4 gallons right now, and it's very much submerged. We are about 2.5 inches deep of water. If your pump stock was at the bottom of this bucket, you'd have probably a solid 2.25 inches of liquid over it. Right now we're on the far side. We're gonna tilt this and completely uncover the pump. So if this was a realistic driving scenario, this would completely starve your pump out almost instantly, and we'll show how much fuel is still left in the bucket. So make the turn, fuel's gone, no more fuel around the pump. But in the bucket, you still have a reasonable level of fuel covering the stock. It's starting to get to the point where the far edge might be starting to get uncovered depending on the height, but it still has some fuel to pull from. And again, a lot of this is because I need to seal those check valves up better because you could see it trickling around out the bottom, which is from it leaking around the ring. But now we got to a point where we'd probably be uncovered, but that's a pretty extreme scenario with the pump being in the middle, far side of the tank, and the tank shifting all the way to one side. And we're still not factoring in that there would be some fuel returning back into the bucket from the bypass regulator, and you also probably wouldn't be attempting anything near that kind of G-forces on a quarter of a tank of fuel, realistically. So I think this is going to be pretty good. We could even try another gallon and just see how that goes. So here's 5 gallons in the tank. I do think this would be substantially improved by sealing the ring area around where the one-way check valves go. I do think that a larger gasket around the back end of those would seal that up. So that would be complete starvation right there. And you can see we still have ample fuel in this bucket for that pump to keep continuing function. How long it could suck that for, I don't know. We'll have to do a little bit of math on that, but I have a feeling that's pretty good and probably sufficient. But what I did here was I filled the bucket up to about the level that we just showed was approximately a quarter of a tank, maybe even a little bit less than a quarter of a tank from what we were kind of testing out in that Tupperware. And I wanted to see what kind of fuel consumption that would be at that level. So I measured this out and it comes out to about 2.5 cups of fluid, which basically means that at that level, if you were to tilt the tank and all the fuel sloshed away and you were left with nothing but what was in the bucket, if you had 8 injectors, sorry, I have a V8, but 8 injectors flowing 650 cc's per minute, which should support about 525, 550 wheel on E85, assuming you weren't returning any of that fuel and you were using every last drop of that fuel and those injectors were at 100% duty cycle, which obviously isn't realistic, but we're just saying for sake of experimentation. So if you were using that amount of fuel, you'd be going through about 0.336 cups per second. So roughly 1/3 of a cup per second. So if at a quarter of a tank, this bucket is holding a capacity of about 2.5 cups. That means that wide open throttle, completely starved of fuel, using nothing but what's left in the bucket during that turn, corner, or whatever, you would have about, I think, 7.5 seconds of fuel in the bucket at your disposal. Of course, this isn't an exact science because some fuel is getting out around the edges and through the check balls, and you also can't really get every last drop of fuel at the bottom because the sock is still sitting a little bit, above the level. But again, that's a quarter of a tank, which probably isn't a realistic scenario to be racing on. And it's also assuming that you're using every last drop of that fuel and none of it is replenishing back into the bucket through the bypass. And you're also at such a high G-force that the fuel is completely sloshed away and none of it is overlapping with the bucket. So I would say that this is pretty safe, that it should work under pretty much any scenario. So we take a look at the Viper board, and on the cost front, this is what everything cost me right here. This is the part number for the Holley Dodge truck fuel pump module. You could also get some money back from selling the brand new 255 liter per hour pump that comes with it. The Lidar sender was $125. The bucket was about $10 from Amazon. 525 Hellcat pump was $150 with the sock and the hose assembly. The Aeromotive one-way check valves were $100 for the 4. There's some other expenses in here. Obviously, the strip of aluminum I use, screws, springs, but I don't think any of that adds up to any more than let's just call it even $50 or $30 to make it an even number or something like that. But as you can see, that's a pretty good price for a fuel system that'll support probably upwards of $650 on E85 to the wheels and control fuel well enough to be driven on a road course, hopefully. Fingers crossed, we'll see how it works out. And using a pump that you could readily replace if something goes wrong with it. It's not hard to find or extremely expensive. So I think it works. And I know it's not a perfect test because gasoline is more viscous than water, so it'll flow a little bit easier through those cracks and crevices and drain quicker. But I think for now, this will work. We'll give it some testing actually in the car when it's all ready. And I don't think there's any need to make any changes except for I would like to put the larger gasket in behind those check valves so that it hopefully seals those up a little bit better and you lose less fuel around this ring through those openings. But other than that, I think it would probably work fine even as is, but it can't hurt to try to perfect it a little bit more. So you may be wondering why I didn't use a surge tank setup, and that's a good question. I probably could have, and it probably would work, But what I didn't like about it was to use a 525 liter per hour pump, you're supposed to use roughly half that capacity for your lift pump. So the Viper factory pump isn't anywhere close to that capacity, half that capacity. I think it's like 190 liter per hour. So if I were to use that, you'd have the potential of starving the starving the surge tank pump. And then I also don't like the fact that if I'm not using a factory Viper pump, so if I wanted to upgrade to like a Walbro 255 for the lift pump, now you can't use that siphon effect of the factory bucket. Now you're starving the lift pump all the time, which is obviously the point of a surge tank setup, is to have fuel when the lift pump starves. But if you're really starving that a lot and often in an 18-gallon tank with that much surface area that the fuel is sloshing at half tank or less, how often can you starve that pump out before you burn the pump out? Pumps are cooled via the fuel going through them. So when you starve a pump dry like that frequently, you really shorten the life of the pump. So I didn't like that. And I also just think this is easier because I don't have to worry about multiple fuel pumps. It's a little more reliable, more simple, and I like that for a track car. Other than that, I also didn't have the factory Viper fuel pump module, so I still would have had to buy a pump and some kind of a hat or something that works with it, or the module, which all adds up. So this just seemed like the best scenario for me.